Swords. Swords are some of the, if not the, most iconic weapons in all of history. And today, we'll be talking about how to draw them. But first, some self-introduction. I am Centuri, and I love swords, history, and fucking anime. It's been several months since I made a video, so here you assholes fucking go. But just in case some of you are fucking robots that take things way too fucking literally, this is only my perspective and how I personally like to draw swords, and is by no means the only way to do so. So if I hear anyone go, "But Centuri, I can draw swords not using your method," I will fucking impale you. Now that we're done with the formalities, let's talk about what makes a good sword design. I believe that there are three main things about drawing weapons, and these are proportion, shape, and intention. These, along with some other smaller factors, will affect the design of the sword that you're drawing. There's a lot of swords I could use as an example, not just from history, but also from fantasies. But in order to draw these, one must understand la source, or the reference it came from. So for the sake of simplicity, let's stick to history, because the best sauce you can get is IRL. As an example, I'm going to be using the most iconic sword that almost everybody can recognize, the longsword. Sword semantics are weird, so just bear with me, please. Just when I show you a silhouette, you probably know what I'm talking about already. It's easily seen in designs, pop culture, and fantasies, since it's basically just a cross. Swords aren't just one whole thing though. You have to keep in mind what are the major parts you're going to be focusing on. These are the blade, the crossguard, handle, and pommel. For a dumbed down explanation for you shit-for-brains watching, the blade is the stabby part. The crossguard, or guard if you prefer, is there to protect your hand. The handle is where you grip your sword. And the pommel basically fits it all together, or acts as a counterweight. Now that we know the major parts, let's begin with proportion. But what do I mean when I say proportion? Well, it's simply making sure that when you draw a part of something, you take into account how it looks like with the whole drawing. For example, I could be so focused on drawing the blade that when I look at the whole drawing, I see that the blade is too short, or that the crossguard is too big, or the handle is too thin. So keep proportion in mind, making sure that nothing's too big or too small, and that everything fits perfectly together. A way of checking the sword's proportions is to imagine what it would feel like when you use it. A big, heavy chopping blade needs adequate leverage, which would affect the length of the handle. A crossguard just needs to not interfere with the way you hold the sword. Well, that is if you decide to put a guard at all. The handle needs to actually feel comfortable, making it just right for the hands. You'll be holding them for a while anyway. Make sure that it's not too thin, or it would look like it would snap. Just like my sword. The pommel acts as a counterweight to balance the sword out. Make sure it does not interfere with your hand. The next step is using the right shape, or geometry for you fucking nerds. Almost all drawings are derived from shapes, from faces to backgrounds, and that includes swords too. When it comes to drawing swords, the shape tends to describe a lot about itself and what it's used for. Is it thin, pointy, and nimble? Curved deeply and elegant? Or broad to the point of being heavy? There are also more subtle things you need to take into account, like the taper of your sword, which describes how it gradually thins out at the point, or the direction or flow of your sword, like the katana, which has a subtle curve versus a tulwar, which has a very pronounced curve, or a balasyong, which curves itself like an S. You don't have to strictly draw basic shapes for a sword, but just the idea of the shape, because a bad example of a sword is a sword that's all over the place, spikes everywhere, and has no shape in mind. But using a shape as a guide can make it seem so much cleaner. And the final thing to consider is the intent of what you're trying to convey with the sword. Is the character a brute in a harsh fantasy world? You can push the proportions to their extremes by making the sword thicker to emphasize strength, and adding jagged features to emphasize its crudeness. Is the character a noble and skilled sword fighter? In that case, maybe a thinner blade with a decorated crossguard would work better. Or maybe you're making a fantasy world and you want a sword for your population. Well, then use the context of their surroundings. Do they fight in enclosed or tight areas? Maybe pick a shorter style of sword. Do they battle beasts rather than humans? Maybe thick swords are better. A duelist utopia? Maybe thin, fast blades are better. When it comes to design, the best advice I could give you is to just look up references. The way other people interpret design could give you the inspiration you might need. If you ever need ideas, just look at history, as historical swords have been shaped by the needs of their users and the culture that surrounds them. So if I were to recommend a channel, I'd say Schola Gladiatoria, as Matt has a lot of good insight and contextualization, and might just spark some inspiration for your next sword design, with a diversity of his sword topics from Europe to Middle East all the way to Asia, and some weird ones as well. TLDR, just fucking use a reference!
甘い香りのシロップ何気ない時間にかけてときめく足を君だけに教えたいな口臭が溢れて